Okay, I wanted to talk about why there wasn't inflation after 2008 and why those conditions no longer necessarily apply. So there are three or four main reasons I want to get into. The first reason is that in 2008, the deficits were mostly financed through borrowing, and only a very small portion of the deficit was directly funded by the Federal Reserve. While this time, the vast majority of the deficit is being directly monetized by the Federal Reserve. So deficits aren't nearly as inflationary if they're financed through borrowing rather than just being directly monetized. So that's the first thing that's different. The other thing that's different is that while after 2008 there was a very significant degree of money printing and asset purchases by the Federal Reserve, that money, once it was distributed, just mostly settled around collecting dust in obscure financial bank accounts. This time around, a huge portion of the money is actually making its hands to the ordinary people. And that's why I'm showing this graph, which is M2 money stock. Now, the M2 money supply includes deposits in people's savings accounts, so it's more directly money that ordinary people actually have. As you can see, the money supply, the rate of increase of the money supply did not increase after 2008. It stayed at roughly the same pattern it had been for the previous 30 years. But you can see that around 2020, there's been a huge spike in the increase of the money supply, so that's increasing substantially faster than it has been. And this is just demonstrating that this time, a substantial portion of the money is making its hands to ordinary people who actually have a propensity to spend it in the actual economy and ordinary goods. So that's the second main factor that's different from 2008. So far I've talked about how this time most of the deficit is being directly monetized by the Fed instead of financed through borrowing, and that a substantial portion of the money is actually getting into the hands of ordinary people rather than just sitting around collecting dust in some obscure financial bank accounts. The third thing that's different is that around 2008, China had only recently integrated into the global economy, and its low wages were serving as a disinflationary sink that was keeping costs low, preventing inflation. However, things have changed substantially since then. As you can see, this is a graph of wages in China, and they've risen substantially since 2008. You can see they're about 2.5 times, 3 times higher. In addition, China's exchange rate has appreciated like 10% since then, and a lot of goods in China have very high tariffs slapped on them. In addition, most offshoreable jobs have already been offshored, so even if these previous factors weren't in play, and China could still produce goods at the same low cost it could produce at its low cost peak, or maybe trough. Just the fact that we're out of jobs to export, and there's going to be net creation of jobs that are unexportable, at least in the short term, means that this inflationary effect is going to be substantially reduced. And now, in addition, there are much higher tariffs on Chinese goods in general. Trade relations in general aren't as good. China's currency has appreciated like 10%, and wages in China are like 2 or 3 times higher than they were, and are still rising steadily, and costs in China are much higher and are only going to keep rising. As you can see, the share of China's labor force in agriculture has steadily decreased. And if you project what's been happening into 2021, then that means that only 23% of China's labor force is still in agriculture. So that you combine that with China's population starting to shrink, and China is out of new labor to throw into factories, and for China to increase its exports, wages that are going to have to increase substantially at a much higher rate than they have been. So costs in China are going to go up dramatically after they've already risen a huge amount. And China is no longer going to serve as a disinflationary force. They're going to export inflation. So with China no longer being relied on to be a disinflationary sink, there's going to be much higher inflationary forces. And you combine that with those two other factors, and you can see why there wasn't inflation after 2008, but those factors are no longer serving to keep a lid inflation net L, which is why inflation has already risen to much higher levels than it has been throughout all the 2008 period. Now, those factors gave the US time to bring its budget more into balance, and for the Federal Reserve to stop asset purchases and to begin to tighten money supply. So we'll see if that happens this time, or if there's enough time, because inflation is already rising right now. So the Fed doesn't have the same amount of time it did last time to tighten policy and cease its asset purchases. So as you can see, inflation's already been a lot higher. So as you can see, the Federal Reserve stopped purchasing assets around 2015, meaning that it stopped printing large amounts of money. And also, the federal deficit was reduced substantially during this period, so it was like 10% of GDP at its peak, and it declined to only 2% of GDP. You can also see how inflation is already a lot higher than it has been so far. So there isn't time for the budget deficit to be reduced, or the Federal Reserve to stop its asset purchases before inflation becomes more prominent. In addition, they're not even trying to balance the budget this time around. But we'll see what actually happens when they actually pass the budget next year. Now, you might be thinking, okay, costs in China are going up, but aren't there a lot of other countries in the world with lower wages than China? And the answer is technically yes, but not really. Like, a lot of countries in the world actually have higher wages in China. For example, Thailand and Malaysia already have higher wages than in China. And in Indonesia, wages are higher than in are a little lower than in China, but they have worse infrastructure than in China, and because they have a smaller population, they can't get the same economics of scale, so it's not really more competitive than China. The countries that are the next best options after China are Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Morocco. Vietnam probably has the best infrastructure in the world for a country that has lower wages than in China, but because they're much smaller than China, if only 10% of China's export capacity relocates to Vietnam, then suddenly their per capita exports are substantially higher than China, so wages in Vietnam are going to rise much faster than they did in China. And the same also applies into Bangladesh and Morocco because they also have much smaller populations than China. And because they're much smaller population-wise than China, they can never get the same economics of scale China did, so they'll never be as competitive in that regard. And also, I think Morocco and Bangladesh have somewhat worse infrastructure than China did when it had similar wage levels. So no country is ever going to combine the same low wages with the same economics of scale and fully developed industrial agglomerations and supply chains, and the same highly developed quality infrastructure as China did at its peak. Other countries may eventually develop the same supply chains, economics of scale, and infrastructure, but it won't be until they're much more developed and therefore have substantially higher wages than China did at its point. So we've already reached the point of peak cost competitiveness that any country can ever do. Now, in India's case, it has a similar large population of China, so it could, in theory, get the same economics of scale. But because at this point, right now, their export sector is much smaller than China's was as a percent of GDP, and they have much worse infrastructure, India doesn't really have a chance of being as competitive with China anytime soon. And by the time that India resolves these issues, again, it's going to be much more developed, so its wages are going to be much higher, and so they can never be as competitive as China. So there really is no region of the world that can ever be more competitive than China is right now. Either the countries already have higher wages than China does, or the wages are only a little bit lower than China's, which means they can't be as competitive because of reasons of economics of scale alone. Or they have much lower wages than China, but their infrastructure is completely undeveloped. And you combine that with the fact that they just don't have the same economics of scale, and they're just completely uncompetitive in spite of their low wages. That's what's happening in Africa. That's the only region in the world where wages are significantly lower than China's levels, rather than just slightly lower, as in, say, Vietnam or Morocco. I mean, wages are a little lower in Bangladesh, but Bangladesh is only one small country. However, because Africa is completely undeveloped, you really can't access the low-cost labor supply there right now. I mean, if they develop in the future, that'll be different, but that's at least 10 years away. Because you can't just access the low-cost labor in a completely undeveloped country. Because you need the entire supply chain for the industry set up. Because otherwise, you have to import the components from overseas because they're not made in the country, and you have to pay the huge substantial cost, the huge transportation cost to ship those goods hundreds of miles from different countries, usually with much higher wages, and so you just cannot produce the goods competitively unless the entire supply chain is set up within the country and you don't have to import the intermediate goods. Combine that with the fact that you just don't have economics of scale if you only have like one or two factories set up in the country, and so the cost of the infrastructure, like the roads and ports, have to be pooled by a very small number of factories. Whereas if the country became more developed, then those same roads and ports could serve maybe hundreds of factories, and the cost of those infrastructure would be pooled by hundreds of times the number of factories, substantially reducing the per capita cost of supporting that infrastructure and making the factories much more competitive. So, because of those reasons, completely undeveloped countries cannot be competitive at all unless they develop substantially to a point where they overcome those obstacles, but wages are still pretty low, but somewhat higher than subsistence. So, in short, there's nowhere in the world that can produce at lower cost than China, except three countries. And in those three countries, wages are going to rise substantially faster because they're much smaller in size than China. So, if the same amount of industry goes to those countries, then their level of development and the per capita number of industries will be much higher and rise much quicker. So that is why China is no longer serving as a disinflationary sink, and therefore why the factors that kept inflation down after 2008 are no longer in play. Again, to recap, the other two reasons besides China's higher costs are the fact that most of the deficit is now being monetized directly by the central bank instead of being financed by borrowing, and that most of the and a substantial amount of the money is actually getting into the hands of ordinary consumers who have a propensity to spend it rather than just sitting collecting dust in obscure financial bank accounts. So that's what's happening, and I just wanted to talk about this issue because I found it interesting. And that's it.